Cheers.
Hello, I'm Katherine Stockton. I wrote Colloquium, which is going to be at the Camden Fringe, Hen and Chickens Theatre, 1st to the 4th of August, and the Golden Goose Theatre, 5th to the 6th of August. So, next week.
And I'm Sean. I'm playing Alfred in said production of Colloquium.
Do you have a specific character other than your own character that is your favourite in this play, and why? And could you give us a bit of background on that character?
Ooh. I think all the characters are interesting. All of them have got a decent foundation. All of them have got a unique voice. I mean, I would probably say Bennett is the one I would want to play the most if I wasn't playing Alfred, but I think that's partly informed by the fact that Bennett is the one I'm playing opposite the most.
Who's Bennett?
So Bennett is the junior professor who is trying to take over Alfred's, or was hoping to take over Alfred's job when he retires at the end of the academic year.
Head of Department of English.
Yes, head of the English faculty. Yes. So yeah, obviously Alfred and Bennett have a lot of interaction, and so I see that character quite a bit. But I think there's also they play sort of two sides of the same coin, so it'd be quite interesting for me to play Bennett and see it from the other side.
Yeah.
I've been playing Alfred, as you well know, for about 5 years now, so yeah, it would be interesting.
I do think playing the other side of that coin would be interesting. Alfred and Bennett definitely work as foils to each other.
Oh yeah, 100%.
One person, Alfred's leaving this world of academia because the play takes place in his last year as having tenure as a professor. Whilst Bennett is just kind of, he's been in this world for a little while, but in a way he's emerging into it because he's becoming head of department. So they're very much at opposite ends of their career.
There's an interesting aspect to it though, with the fact that Bennett was a student in that world of sort of Oxbridge universities, whereas Alfred wasn't. And so there's this really interesting aspect of their relationship where, despite the fact that they are sort of the senior and the junior in teaching terms, there are points in the play where Bennett makes it very clear that he almost has a greater claim to that world than Alfred does, which is really interesting and makes for a really interesting conflict.
He calls, I think that's an interesting observation, because absolutely there's like a power struggle throughout the play between those two, and I think part of that power struggle is who has the bigger claim to this mythic world of Oxbridge, or whichever one they go to, or whichever one they teach at. But Bennett, the younger, explicitly does call Alfred the Elder the master of this universe.
Yes.
So it's almost like he acknowledges that Alfred is a senior in words, but often undermines him in action.
Yeah.
I think their push and pull is very central to the play. Are there any aspects of Alfred's character that you, as Sean Bennett, identify with?
I mean, I imagine I share certain aspects with of his character. I must do, otherwise you wouldn't have asked me to play him for so long. Yeah, I think Alfred is. I think he's a man that has quite a large sense of duty. And wanting to do the right thing, but sometimes finding himself in positions where he can't quite figure out what that is. And I think, not just for me, but for everyone, I think that's a very relatable situation to be in. I think that's something
duty,
that...
and not knowing what your duty is necessarily too. That's fantastic. That's brilliant.
Exactly. So like you have this kind of innate desire to do the right thing, but you aren't necessarily equipped with the tools to figure out what the right thing is. Yes. And I think everyone finds himself in that kind of situation sometimes. and it's something that is sort of brought into pretty sharp relief in the play with Alfred, because he's presented certainly by those around him as this kind of stalwart of the world, the sort of Oxbridge universe. But actually, throughout the course of the play, he flip-flops a fair amount. Like, he's supporting one method of teaching one moment, then going against it the next. And it's very clear that he's going through a period of not really knowing what's best for him, what's best for Bennett, what's best for the students, and what's best for sort of the culture of Oxbridge and society at large.
It's interesting that you bring up the different methods of teaching, because one of the major themes in the play is whether to teach going into university, whether it's best to learn things by rote and be a good exam taker and someone who can use their memory and knowledge, or whether it's more about innate natural talent, and which of those things has the most value and which of those things Oxbridge is looking for. And also, if it is the latter, how do you test that and how do you quantify that? How do you quantify natural talent?
Yeah.
And that's a theme that came from, I borrowed or magpied from Alan Bennett's The History Boys.
A favourite play of both of ours, actually.
That idea of not quite knowing the battle between wanting to teach the best things you can, but and the best candidates you can, and the best students you can, but also then having to be in a system where you have to quantify all that. You have to grade it, you have to scale it.
That's the peculiar thing about I think it's one of the sort of golden nuggets of the whole play, and it's one of the reasons why the play works, is that you've got a situation where universities like Cambridge, like Oxford, like others to be fair, pride themselves on looking past. They require high exam grades, of course they do, but they pride themselves on looking past that and wanting original thinkers, and which is why they put their students through these sometimes absurd entry interviews, which we are investigating and to some extent parodying. What's the parodying? Thank you. Which we are to some extent parodying here with Colloquium. But the irony is that they, like you say, they still have to quantify that, and so all that they really have achieved is replacing one predetermined rubric with another. And so
but that second one has like a weird mythic, untouchable value to it.
And this is why I think we see a lot of a certain kind of school feeding into Cambridge and Oxford, because it's not necessarily to do with a higher level of education, it's to do with the style of education that they are delivered. So whereas these sort of ancient stone universities are wanting to break the mould, what they're actually doing is just creating a new mould, and students and teachers and institutions have a choice which mode of teaching they want to go for, which will determine then which universities their students will be able to get into. But at its core, they are the same thing. You are teaching for a test.
Just which kind of test?
Yeah.
It's interesting that you say like style of education, because even that phrase kind of makes me wince a bit. Like as a teacher, like the idea of education having different styles and like different kind of like performances, and different kids from different backgrounds getting a different like style of teaching kind of makes me stomach flip a bit, and I don't necessarily know why.
It's the idea of education is supposed to be a consistent one, right? It's supposed to be, you've got for some subjects you have true and false, and for others you at the very least have the right way of thinking for something to draw the most analysis out of it, right? But education just isn't that cut and dry, and I don't think it can be. And if you look at this, or if you look at plays like The History Boys, it makes very clear that that kind of performing at education, where sometimes it's not even about the facts, but rather how you present them.
Performing education.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. both on like an institutional level, like as we said, like Oxford is kind of doing this, Oxford and Cambridge kind of doing this whole performance of the myth of the interview. That's kind of a performance in yourself. You go to the room, you sit down, you're interviewed. It's almost like a play in itself, that whole thing, but also like performance on an individual level.
Yeah.
Like when I was growing up, my dad was a teacher and he taught in the school I went to, and seeing him in the classroom versus seeing him at home, he was just a completely different figure.
Yeah. Well, you're a teacher yourself.
Yes.
And like you know that performing, you must know that obviously what you put forward in the classroom is different. Even in my exceptionally short teaching career, even when you're doing teacher training, it's made quite clear that you learn very quickly that to be a teacher is to take on a role.
And I think, bringing it back to the play, that I think Alfred, your character in his final year of teaching, is kind of maybe coming to realise that he has been spending his entire life and career performing, and that performance is coming to an end. So there's almost like a thespian-like mourning over his final curtain, I guess. And how he has to leave all that behind, not just academia, but also his the identity and the role that he's created within that space.
I think also he probably doesn't know particularly what to do with himself afterwards. If you've been playing a role for so long, it must be difficult to leave it behind. Teaching, people often stay, once they've been teachers for a while, stay as teachers for their entire careers, and those who have been doing it for decades will sometimes stay beyond times where they could have retired because they don't really know what to do. They don't really know how to not be a teacher or an educator. And I think Alfred is going through a very similar thing. He's been walking the halls of these ancient stone colleges for so long that I imagine the prospect of not doing that is quite terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. Big question. Do you think that Oxford and Cambridge have a place in today's changing Britain?
I think there is value in the history of them to some extent, and I think there is, and they do things differently that does have different results for their students. The big question is whether or not that's down to the quality of teachers and teaching that they have there, or whether it's because of the name that ends up on the degree that these students hold. I think, these are ancient institutions, and so any talk of dismantling them is naive at best.
Yeah.
And I think they have value, but I do think that I think plays like this and articles, media, art of any kind that tries to just draw back the curtain a little bit might help to lift the mysticism and therefore bring them closer to, the 21st century, where people are less blinded by that history and that mysticism and can analyse them with a more sort of level head. I don't personally know. I didn't study at Oxbridge. I do know some people who have. I don't know whether the quality of their education is better. I don't know if the way they do things is better or not. What I do know about them, because it's what everyone knows about them, is the traditions and the pomp and ceremony around them. And so it's entirely possible that Oxford and Cambridge are indeed doing amazing things behind closed doors and are completely justified and worthy of their place at the top of the University League charts. It's also possible that we've all been sort of hoodwinked by this history and this performance, and actually they don't deserve it.
Yeah.
I can't tell which is the truth. Yeah,
I think I agree, especially when it comes to the idea of dismantling them being naive. I do think that changing them, however, to suit more of today's Britain is possible. I mean, there are still, they offer a certain amount of places guaranteed. So Oxford will offer a certain amount of places guaranteed to schools such as Harrow and Eton.
Yeah.
Whilst teachers at say schools in North London will actively discourage some of their kids from applying. Waste of time.
Yeah.
So they exist as like monoliths of division, I guess. And obviously the play explores how some of the characters are trying to change that. So they're trying to use contextual interviews as a way of narrowing that gap. So you are more generous in your rating of a candidate if they come from a certain underprivileged background, at the expense of just taking in who does the best.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the notion in the play is an interesting one, because these kind of educational institutions would, if they were to operate purely on a meritocracy, they would still be unevenly taking students from privileged backgrounds.
Yes.
And so
because the problem starts much earlier on.
Exactly. So in principle, you know, I think most people who give any thought to these kind of issues would argue that a meritocracy is going to be the most sensible way to figure out these kind of things, right? And the really interesting thing that is touched on in Colloquium, and where you see the two sides of the argument, is that whilst that would, in an ideal world, be the most sensible way to divvy up spaces in an institution that appears to give in the highest standard of education, like Cambridge or Oxford, in reality that doesn't work, because 15 years before students get there, they are started off at different levels, and therefore it's got nothing.
Yes.
It won't always be to do with how skilled they are, but rather the opportunities they've been given.
I feel like a sister play to this could be about how when a new promising school is built in a city, like middle class families will move, or upper middle class families move into that area and immediately buy up all the housing. So they're even in the catchment area, you still have like more privileged kids going to better schools, and that therefore the housing prices also rise when that school is built there. So it's kind of, you're right, like the kid if you're in an upper middle class neighbourhood, even though you just meant to go to the school that's closest to you and not necessarily be sent to a better school, unless your parents want to pay for private education, you're still walking into a school that's got more funding and got better education, because of how it's just a massive cycle.
And that's the nice thing about that. I think that's one of the reasons why plays like Colloquium are as gripping as they are, is because they are a microcosm of the society-wide macrocosm of sort of class differences and wealth inequality and all this kind of stuff. And so despite the fact that this is certainly not obviously, and certainly not on first viewing, a political piece,
it's not explicitly political.
Exactly. It definitely
but
has something
yes
to contribute to that conversation.
I think despite having written it, the more I watch it, the more I watch you guys play it, like the words like class or politics aren't explicitly in the play, because it is all about character, but when you absorb it, it's like the play is about class, I think.
Yeah.
Education, obviously, but also class in Britain.
So only the small topics.
and how that class, class hierarchies in Britain just solidified and became what they are in the 80s, and how it's still, those waves are still crashing over us today, with the north-south divide, and London being like this like centre of massive wealth but also massive poverty, and how the like geopolitical landscape, and how all people from all those different areas of the geopolitical landscape, and Wales as a massive the economy there's failing, how all these people from different spaces all feed into these two universities. Well, they try to anyway, and how those two universities respond to differently to those different types of people. Why should people come and see Colloquium?
Why should people come and see Colloquium? Pretty sure I did this for you earlier, didn't I?
You did.
Why did you write it?
Why did I write Colloquium?
Yeah.
I wrote Colloquium because I went through further education and higher education at university, and I always felt like I was a step behind. I felt like I was there to achieve something, and that something was like a will-o'-the-wisp of like becoming well-read or becoming intellectual or becoming qualified, and I thought I was going to arrive, and I kept waiting to arrive at that thing that I was told to attain at university so then I could go and get a job. And I never felt like I got there. Even when I had my scroll in my hand, I was like, did I miss the bit where I was meant to feel like I became something?
Yeah.
Because I was sold this myth of becoming something at university, and I never achieved it. And that was quite an isolating feeling, and I was wondering whether other people were feeling the same way. Like, I've been sold a myth here, and the myth of becoming this version of myself that's, because I studied literature, is like well-read and cultured. It doesn't feel like it's happening. Like, I was reading and I was absorbing culture, but I didn't feel like I'd cocooned and then butterflied into this new thing.
Yeah.
So I wanted to write.
And that feeling is times 100 if you're going to somewhere like Cambridge, not
Exactly.
Right? Is any university, you kind of get sold that myth, and I had a similar experience. But if you're going to one of these, world-renowned places with centuries upon centuries of history, of course you sort of walk in and feel like you should be transformed by this.
Yes.
So,
I thought originally from writing it from like a student's point of view, like my point of view, but then I thought it'd be a much more interesting play to write about it from the people who actually have the responsibility of selling and then trying to perform this mythical transformation and the pressures that they're under. Because I imagine not feeling transformed is hard, but feeling like you must transform someone else because you have all this history on your back as a professor of one of the best colleges and one of the best universities, like that must be worse, I reckon.
Do you think...
Even though you're in a massive position of privilege.
Yes.
It's still harder.
Do you think there's any value in terms of education to the kind of mysticism and the rich traditions and the history and all this stuff that we from the outside might look in and go, well, that seems absurd? Banquets every Friday or weekend or whatever it happens to be, and, the way they refer to each other and all this kind of stuff. From the outside, you can look in and go, that seems crazy. But do you think there's any value? Do you think it places people in a certain frame of mind, or to actually help produce the kind of people that they are trying to produce?
I mean, the idea of the university trying to produce a type of person, I don't like.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think so. I think obviously it's enjoyable and it probably is somewhat motivating for the person in space. But to me, it either comes across like very self-indulgent, very, very indulgent to have like all this pomp and ceremony and smoke and mirrors around what is essentially just learning, and kind of like a cult. But a cult that stays with you for life, because once you're part of this Oxford and Cambridge process, once you have that stamp on your CV, like you have a network, you have reputation, you have privilege, and you can pull on those strings for the rest of your life. And I'm sure all that idea of like we're kind of in this bubble and in this cult is massively solidified by this ceremony and ritual of it all. The outfits, the name calling, even the verbal tics like Cambridge Jesus, Oxford Balliol, like the familiarity through their own like lexicon. Yeah, I don't think it has. I don't think it's a good thing.
Do you see Colloquium as attempting to pass sort of fairly harsh judgment on these systems, or more just to analyse them and let audience come to their own conclusion?
I think previous versions have been trying to cast a harsh judgment on it, but I think because the play is so focused on individuals, I think you are drawn between like empathy and sympathy for the individuals versus quite harsh criticism for the situation they're in, the system that they're in. But then because those characters are perpetuating that system, it's like a push and pull between who do I actually feel bad for here and what do I feel bad for. So I think probably the latter is like here's the situation, how I see it. Katherine Stockton, here's how I see Oxford and Cambridge, and yeah, it's then for the audience to decide whether they want to say no, tradition and history and precedence has value and it's part of Britain's history and culture, and it's bred this system has clearly bred some of our most brilliant thinkers and pushed our society forward. Or whether they said no, this privilege producing pomp and ceremony needs to go and needs to change. I see both sides.
You said that before you started writing this, you were thinking about writing from a student's perspective as a sort of proxy for yourself and your own experience. Are any of the characters in this version sort of the de facto proxy for yourself? Who would you say is the closest of them?
I think all the characters, when people write, their characters always seem to echo a part of themselves. So I say a bit of me in all of them. But there is a character called George who is a PhD student. Now, I've not done a PhD, but I want to one day. And his whole thing is that he has been told his whole life that he's superior to the people around him because he is extremely well educated. He's almost overeducated. I love that word. Someone said that to me at one point. I was like, that's brilliant. That's exactly how I feel sometimes. Overeducated to the point where you become distanced from people who are not at your level of education. Not saying I'm super smart or anything. I've just spent a lot of time in education. So that's kind of separated me from the real world sometimes. So when he has to face the real world after being in education for so long, it kind of crushes him because he realizes that although he's always been told that he is brilliant in that bubble, when he's forced out of it and his identity is ripped away, his academic identity, and he has to just be George and not George BA MA PhD.
Yeah.
And he hasn't got all that to fall back on. Like he spirals, and leaving university, leaving my masters, and going into the real world was a readjustment for me. So, and I think I do, as a flaw personally, seem to form a lot of my identity around my academic skill. So when I don't have that to pull on, when I'm in a situation where I can't pull on that.
Yeah. There's a fantastic line from George during his monologue, which is a fantastic monologue, and worth coming to see the play just for that, where he talks about drowning in the robes of his education. And I remember that the first time I heard that line, I always thought that was such a nice idea, not just the sort of metaphor, but like from like a practical perspective, academic dress, as anyone who has ever been to a graduation knows, is this kind of flowy, far too large, like kind of nonsense outfit that has no practical meaning whatsoever. It's designed for grandeur and to make you look bigger and more distinguished. And especially in the context that line is delivered, I always thought that was a really, possibly the most succinct description of basically what the core of this play is about.
Yeah.
That idea of layers and layers and layers of education, and eventually
the more you get, the more they stifle you.
Yeah. But I think, and it is really important to point out that the play doesn't argue that learning is something that will stifle you. I mean, I'm sure you and I and all the people in the play are all for lifelong learning and are always taking an interest in stuff. Specifically, regimented academia
loopholes
is something that...
loopholes, loop jumping? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Like, get through the next fiery loop, learning in that way?
I mean, a lovely metaphor, not one I've heard before. But yeah, that kind of staggered, regimented academia. I think there does come a point where perhaps a person can have been in it for too long. Yeah.
Let me check this thing is still recording. Can you imagine?